He was 70 years old. His hands were broken. He hadn't seen sunlight in 7 years. And yet, on the morning of March 18, 1314, the most powerful men in France were still afraid of what he might say. That tells you something. Jacques de Molay had been a prisoner since October 13, 1307, a date so catastrophic for the Knights Templar that some historians believe it's literally where we get the superstition about Friday the 13th. 7 years. 7 years of cold stone cells, of interrogations that stretched through the night, of watching his brothers break one by one under torture. 7 years of signing confessions he would later say were lies forced out of him under unimaginable pain. And now they dragged him out in front of a crowd in Paris, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, to make one final public statement confirming everything he'd supposedly admitted. They expected him to bow his head, to nod along, to disappear quietly into a monastery and die in obscurity. That was the deal. He didn't take the deal. But to understand why that moment matters, why it still matters 700 years later, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Jacques de Molay actually was and what the Knights Templar actually were before Philip IV of France decided to destroy them. Here's the thing most people get wrong about the Templars. They think of them as this secretive, mystical brotherhood, half warrior, half monk, guarding holy relics and protecting ancient secrets. And there's a reason that image exists. The Templars deliberately cultivated mystery. But the real story is actually more interesting than the myth, and far more dangerous.
The Knights Templar were founded in 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade. A small group of knights approached the Patriarch of Jerusalem with a proposition. They would dedicate themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were given quarters near the Temple of Solomon, which is where the name comes from. Now, within a generation, they had become the most powerful military order in the Christian world. And the reason for that isn't just military skill, though they had that, it's finance. The Templars essentially invented the modern banking system. If you were a wealthy pilgrim traveling from England to Jerusalem, you didn't want to carry a chest of gold across half the known world, too dangerous. So you deposited your money with the Templars in London, received a coded document, and collected your money from a Templar house in Jerusalem. Letters of credit, international banking. They were doing this in the 12th century. By the time Jacques de Molay became Grand Master in 1292, the Templars weren't just a military order anymore. They were a financial empire. They held loans from kings, debts from nobles, properties across every major country in Europe. The French crown itself owed them money, a lot of money. De Molay was, by all accounts, a serious man, not glamorous, not politically slick. He'd spent decades fighting in the Crusades, watching the Christian presence in the Holy Land slowly collapse.
He'd seen Acre fall in 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold, and he'd spent his years as Grand Master trying to organize a new crusade that never quite materialized. He was a soldier who'd become an administrator, and there's something almost tragic about that. He was built for a world that was disappearing. He was also completely unprepared for what was coming, because King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair they called him, which referred to his looks, not his character, was running out of options. He'd expelled the Jews from France and seized their assets. He'd expelled the Italian bankers. He'd debased the currency. He was in debt to the Templars for enormous sums, and he had no real way to pay them back. He needed money. He needed it badly. And then someone, possibly a disgruntled former Templar named Escu de Floiron, came to Philip with a story. The Templars, he said, were heretics. In their secret initiation ceremonies, he claimed, new members were forced to spit on the cross, to deny Christ, to participate in obscene rituals. He had details. He had names. He had exactly what Philip needed to do what he'd been thinking about doing anyway. This is where history gets uncomfortable.
because the charges against the Templars, the heresy, the idol worship, the blasphemy, were almost certainly false. Modern historians are near unanimous on this. But in 1307, in a world where the Pope's authority came directly from God and heresy was the most serious crime imaginable, you didn't need to be guilty. You just needed to be accused.
Philip moved with startling speed and coordination. On the night of October 12, 1307, sealed orders were delivered to royal officers across France, orders they were told not to open until dawn the next morning. When they opened them, every Templar in France was to be arrested simultaneously, their properties seized, their assets frozen. It was a masterpiece of logistics. In a single morning, hundreds of knights were in chains. Jacques de Molay was arrested in Paris. He would later say he had no idea it was coming. Given what happened to him in the days that followed, that's easy to believe, because the arrests were only the beginning. The torture started almost immediately. And what the inquisitors wanted wasn't just a confession. They wanted something specific. They wanted de Molay, the Grand Master himself, the leader of the entire order, to admit that everything the Templars had stood for was a lie, that the order was rotten from the inside, that God had never been on their side. They wanted him to destroy the Templars with his own words. And for a while, in a dungeon in Paris, with his bones breaking, he did exactly that. There's a question that historians have argued about for centuries, and it's one of those questions that the more you look at it, the more uncomfortable it gets. When does a confession stop being a confession? Jacques de Molay signed a document in the autumn of 1307 admitting to heresy. He admitted to spitting on a crucifix during his initiation into the Templars. He admitted to denying Christ. He admitted, in writing, to things that under medieval law made him worthy of death. He was 70 years old. He'd been tortured.
Now here's what we know about how the Templars were questioned, because the records actually survive. The Inquisitors used a technique called the strappado. You'd have your hands tied behind your back, then you'd be lifted off the ground by a rope attached to your wrists and dropped. Not all the way to the floor, just far enough. The joints in your shoulders would partially dislocate, sometimes fully. They'd do this repeatedly, for hours, over multiple days, and that was considered one of the milder methods. 36 Templars died during interrogation in France, not from execution, from the questioning itself. De Molay confessed quickly, maybe too quickly if you're suspicious, but when you understand what was being done to the men around him, what was presumably being done to him, the speed of that confession starts to look less like guilt and more like a man trying to survive long enough to figure out what to do next. And here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because almost immediately after confessing, de Molay started trying to walk it back.
Not openly at first, he wasn't stupid, but he sent word to Pope Clement V that he wished to speak to him personally, that he had things to say that he could only say to the Pope. This wasn't unusual. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, not to the French crown, so as a legal matter, de Molay had a legitimate claim to papal jurisdiction. Philip IV was furious. He'd arranged the whole operation with papal cooperation. Pope Clement V was, not coincidentally, a Frenchman, elected with strong French support, and the papacy had recently been moved from Rome to Avignon, right inside French territory. Clement was not exactly an independent figure, but he was still technically in charge of heresy proceedings against religious orders, and de Molay was technically his prisoner as much as Philip's. So Clement sent 2 cardinals to interview de Molay in August of 1308. What happened in that room we know from the cardinals' own report. De Molay appeared before them and did something extraordinary. He retracted his confession, all of it. He said the things he'd admitted to were false. He said he'd been tortured into saying them. He said the Templars were innocent. Then he pulled down his shirt and showed them what had been done to his body. The cardinal's report is careful about what it records, but the implication is clear. Whatever they saw was disturbing enough that they included it in official documentation. Now, at this moment, the legal situation becomes genuinely complicated in a way that shows you just how sophisticated this whole proceeding was and just how trapped de Molay really was. His retraction didn't free him. In medieval church law, a relapsed heretic, someone who confessed then took it back, was in a far worse position than someone who simply confessed. A person who confessed could theoretically be reconciled with the church, do penance, and survive. A relapsed heretic had demonstrated that they were beyond saving. The penalty was death. Philip IV and his lawyers knew this. The question of whether de Molay was actually guilty was almost beside the point now. He'd been maneuvered into a position where every move made things worse.
But something was happening simultaneously that was about to complicate everything even further. Outside France, the suppression of the Templars was not going smoothly. In England, in the Iberian kingdoms, in Cyprus, the Templars were being questioned, but confessions were not forthcoming the way they had been in France. The reason, historians generally agree, is that English and Iberian law did not permit the same kinds of interrogation techniques. Without torture, most Templars simply denied the charges. This created an embarrassing problem for Philip. If the Templars in France were guilty of these terrible heresies, why weren't the Templars everywhere else confessing to the same things? Were French Templars uniquely corrupt, or was there something specific about French interrogation methods that produced French confessions? Philip needed this resolved quickly and decisively at the highest level. He pressured Clement to convene a church council, the Council of Vienne, which met from 1311 to 1312 to formally dissolve the Templar order once and for all. The council turned out to be more contentious than anyone expected. Several prominent figures argued that the Templars deserved a proper defense, that the confessions extracted under torture were legally questionable, that dissolving an entire order on this basis set a dangerous precedent. They were right, and it didn't matter. At Vienne, in March 1312, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, a voice on high. The Knights Templar, founded nearly 200 years earlier, were officially dissolved. Not technically condemned, the distinction is important and deliberate. Condemned would have required proof of guilt. Dissolved could be done by papal authority alone, without establishing the charges as true.
It was a legal sleight of hand that let everyone save a little face, but it didn't resolve what to do with Jacques de Molay. He'd been imprisoned for 5 years by this point. He'd confessed, retracted, been threatened with death, watched his order officially cease to exist. Other Templar leaders, the preceptor of Normandy, the visitor of France, others, were still in custody alongside him, waiting for their fates to be decided. In December 1313, Philip IV had finally had enough. He ordered that the remaining Templar leaders be brought before a commission of cardinals for their final sentencing. Given their confessions, everyone assumed the outcome was predetermined: lifetime imprisonment. The order was gone, the men would simply disappear into cells and die quietly. Case closed. Except, nobody told Jacques de Molay that the case was closed. Because when the cardinals read out the sentence on March 18, 1414, in front of Notre Dame, something happened that nobody in that square was prepared for. Picture this moment clearly, because it matters. It's a cold March morning in Paris. The Seine is gray. Notre Dame looms over the square. A crowd has gathered. Executions and public penances drew crowds the way sporting events do today, which tells you something about the age. The cardinals are there in their red robes, royal officials, clergy, ordinary Parisians who had pushed to the front for a better view. And 4 old men are brought out in chains.
Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, Hugh de Perrot, visitor of France, Godfrey de Gonville. All of them had been in prison for over 6 years. All of them had confessed at some point to some version of the charges against them. All of them were, by any reasonable expectation, about to accept their sentences and disappear from history. The cardinals began to read. The charges were rehearsed one more time: heresy, blasphemy, obscene rituals, denial of Christ. The confessions were referenced, the formal dissolution of the order was restated, and then the sentence: life imprisonment. They would never be free, but they would live. De Molay had been reportedly told in advance what the sentence would be. He knew this was coming. He'd spent the night before in whatever cell they kept him in, knowing that in the morning he would stand in that square, hear those words, bow his head, and go back to prison for whatever years remained to him. He had every practical reason to just let it happen. He stood up instead. The exact words he used that morning are not recorded verbatim. We have them through chroniclers who were either there or interviewed witnesses, so there's some variation in the accounts. But the substance is consistent across all of them. He said he was guilty of something, but not of what they'd accused him of. He said he was guilty of having lied, guilty of having falsely confessed to crimes the Templars did not commit out of fear of what was being done to his body. He said the order of the Knights Templar was pure, that the charges against it were fabrications, that the confessions, including his own, had been extracted through torture and were worthless as evidence of anything except how much pain a human being could be put through. He said all of this in public, in front of the cardinals, in front of the royal officials, in front of the crowd. Jacques de Molay stood up and said the same thing.
You have to understand what this meant in practical terms. In medieval church law, what de Molay had just done was not a brave act of defiance, it was a death sentence. By retracting a confession publicly after sentence had already been passed, he had eliminated every remaining legal protection he had. The cardinals who'd been about to send him to prison for life now had no choice. Under canon law, a relapsed heretic, someone who confessed, was given mercy, and then publicly denied their confession, was beyond the church's ability to help. They had to be handed to the secular authority for immediate execution. The cardinals didn't even deliberate. They couldn't. The law was clear. De Molay and de Charny were handed to the provost of Paris. Here's the detail that strikes me every time I think about it. The execution wasn't scheduled. There was no stake already built, no wood already gathered. Philip IV had to order it done that same day, improvised, hurried, on a small island in the Seine called the Île aux Juifs, the island of the Jews, where heretics and criminals were typically burned. They gathered wood, they built a pyre, and as the sun was going down over Paris, they burned Jacques de Molay alive. He was, by most accounts, calm. Contemporary chronicles describe him dying slowly because they'd built the fire at a low burn. Some accounts suggest this was deliberate to prolong the suffering. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he apparently maintained something close to composure for the entire time it took.
One chronicle, written close to the events, says that as the flames rose around him, de Molay spoke. He called out to Pope Clement V. He called out to King Philip IV. He told them both that he would meet them before God before the year was out, that God would judge between them, that the truth of what had been done to him and to his order would be known. Now, historians debate whether he actually said this. It has the quality of a legend, too perfectly shaped, too dramatically satisfying. It's possible it was added later, retrospectively, after events made it seem significant. But here is what is simply, documentably true. Pope Clement V was dead within 40 days of Jacques de Molay's execution. King Philip IV of France was dead 8 months later. He was 46 years old. He suffered what appears to have been a sudden stroke while hunting and died within weeks of the onset. He had been in apparently good health. The last 3 Capetian kings of France, Philip's sons who succeeded him one after another, all died without male heirs. Within 14 years of de Molay's execution, the direct Capetian line that had ruled France for over 300 years was extinct. The chroniclers of the time called it the curse of the Templars. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story of Jacques de Molay usually goes in one of 2 directions, and both of them, honestly, miss the point.
One direction is the mystical one. The Templars become the keepers of the Holy Grail, the ancestors of the Freemasons, the guardians of secrets that powerful men have been suppressing ever since. De Molay becomes a martyr whose death echoes through centuries of esoteric tradition. There are entire libraries of books making these arguments, and almost none of them are grounded in what we actually know. The other direction is the dismissive one. Philip IV wanted money, he manufactured charges, the Pope went along with it, a man died. It was political, it was corrupt, it was ugly, but it was just politics, and there's nothing more to understand. I think both of those responses are a way of not sitting with what's actually interesting about this story. Because what the trial of Jacques de Molay actually shows us is something more specific and more disturbing than either conspiracy or cynicism can account for. It shows us what happens when a legal system is designed not to discover truth, but to produce a predetermined outcome. And it shows us how completely such a system can work, and how fragile it actually is. Think about what Philip's lawyers built. They constructed a process that appeared to have all the features of legitimate justice: formal charges, qualified judges, opportunities for defense, recorded testimony, proper procedures. But every single element of that process had been engineered to ensure that the Templars could not be found innocent. The torture ensured confessions. The confessions were then used as the evidentiary basis for the trial. Retraction of the confessions, far from weakening the case, actually worsened the legal position of anyone who retracted. It was a closed loop. Guilt was built into the architecture of the proceeding.
This is not a medieval aberration. We like to think it is. We like to think that this kind of thing happened because people in the 14th century were superstitious and barbaric, and that we've grown beyond it. But the underlying structure, a process that looks like justice while guaranteeing a predetermined verdict, is something human institutions have recreated in every century since. What de Molay did on that platform in front of Notre Dame was, in a narrow legal sense, catastrophically stupid. He took the one outcome that would have let him survive and threw it away. By any rational calculation of self-interest, he should have stayed quiet. He was an old man. Prison was survivable. He could have died in a cell in a few years, having at least not given Philip the spectacle of a dramatic public execution. But I think he'd done a calculation that wasn't about self-interest at all. The Templars had existed for nearly 200 years. Thousands of men had lived and died under that order. They'd fought wars, built hospitals, managed estates, cared for pilgrims, built a banking system that underpinned European commerce. They had flaws. The order was human, it had internal politics, it had failures of leadership. But the specific charges brought against them in 1307, the heresy, the blasphemy, the obscene rituals, were lies. De Molay knew they were lies. He had known that when he confessed to them, and he had known it through every year of imprisonment that followed.
There is something in the human soul. I think de Molay felt it that morning, that cannot let a lie stand as the last word. Even when accepting the lie would mean survival. Even when every practical argument says, stay quiet, let it go, live. There is something that says, not this particular thing. He was going to die anyway. He knew that, probably. He was 70 years old, broken by imprisonment and torture. He might have had a year or two left in a cell. But there was a difference that apparently mattered enormously to him, between dying with the confession on record and dying with the record corrected. He wanted history to know what had happened. And here's the strange thing about that. It worked. Not immediately. Philip controlled the narrative in France for the remainder of his reign. The official story was that the Templars had been guilty, the proceedings had been just, the dissolution had been proper. Anyone who questioned this was questioning the crown and the papacy simultaneously, which was not a safe thing to do. But the doubts never went away. Contemporary chroniclers outside France were already skeptical. The fact that Templars elsewhere in Europe hadn't confessed to any of this under non-coercive questioning was noted. The speed of Philip's action, moving against the Templars the very morning that sealed orders were opened, looked less like a response to evidence of heresy and more like a prepared financial seizure that happened to use heresy as its legal cover.
Within a generation, people were writing about the Templars with open sympathy. Within a century, the trial was widely understood, at least among educated observers, as a travesty. The curse, de Molay's dying words, real or legendary, had lodged itself in the historical imagination, and it stays there because it captures something true about what happened, even if the specific prophecy is apocryphal. Philip IV got what he wanted. He canceled his debts to the Templars, he seized their assets in France. He eliminated an organization he'd seen as a rival power. By any measure of short-term success, the whole operation worked. He also died at 46. His line ended within 14 years. His name became permanently attached to one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in medieval history. Jacques de Molay died on a small island in the Seine, burned alive at sunset, after 6.5 years of imprisonment for crimes he didn't commit. He also got the last word. History, long, slow, unglamorous history, eventually does that. It doesn't always, it doesn't do it fast enough or completely enough, or with anything like the justice that would actually matter to the people who suffered. But sometimes, across centuries, the record gets corrected. The lie doesn't quite hold. The man who stood up in the square and refused to stay quiet, his voice carries further than the king who silenced him. Jacques de Molay knew he wasn't going to survive that morning. What he seems to have understood with remarkable clarity is that it still mattered what he said. 700 years later, we're still talking about it.